Let's talk Tanya for the 19th of Cheshvan of a leap year. In yesterday's Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explained that every single Jewish person has to fulfill all the mitzvahs, all 613 mitzvahs. The reason for that is because every single one of the mitzvahs becomes a garment for one of the organs, one of the limbs of our soul. And when the neshama, when the soul goes up to Gan Eden, after it departs the body, every single organ needs to have a garment. As we explained yesterday, the idea of this garment is that it's protective gear, because the light in Gan Eden, the energy in Gan Eden, the divine energy is way too intense for the soul to tolerate on its own. And we explained yesterday that the garment, this protective gear, it needs to be constituted of the same substance as the light itself. It needs to be a lessened, diminished, diluted form of that light. That becomes the garment, and then the soul is able to tolerate that incredible energy in Gan Eden. And today we need to talk a little more about the nature of this garment. This garment, which again, as we said, is a diluted form of the actual energy in Gan Eden. What is the energy in Gan Eden? So in Gan Eden, that's where the soul goes to have pleasure. And why is that? Because the light in Gan Eden is the light of God's pleasure, which is called in Kabbalah the oineg, the tainug, the pleasure of God. As we know, that pleasure is a very, very deep and intense expression of the human being. So when we're talking about God's pleasure, we're talking about something very deep, very intense within God himself. And that light is revealed within Gan Eden, that light is revealed in paradise, and that is what the souls take pleasure in. Now, on the one side, we have pleasure, and on the other side, we have desire. And in Chassidus, it is explained at length. Over here in this chapter, it's explained somewhat briefly, but in Chassidus, it's explained at length that pleasure and desire are two sides of the same coin, with pleasure being the internal side and desire being the external side. Why is that? Because when we desire something, why do we desire it? We desire it because it will bring us pleasure. So pleasure is the root, the source of desire. Whenever you see desire, you know that behind it, the internal dimension of that is the pleasure. And by the way, the same thing is the other way around. If I have a strong desire to stay away from something, it's because that thing brings me pain, which is the opposite of pleasure. So if desire flows from pleasure, it's a product of pleasure. I desire something because of the pleasure I get from it. So the desire, which in Hebrew is called ratzoin, that would be the external element or a lessened form of the tainug, of the pleasure. So the garment which the soul wears when it goes up to Gan Eden, in order to protect itself, to be able to tolerate the light in Gan Eden, that garment is made up of ratzoin, of God's desire, which is the external element of God's pleasure. What does that mean, that the garment that the soul wears is made up of God's desire, God's will, God's ratzain? Well, obviously that is a reference to mitzvahs, which are God's desire, as we will see in tomorrow's Tanya.